Hey everyone, I'm Rather Incoherent, and we just wrapped up Edge of the Earth on the channel. This is the tier list I update every time I finish a campaign on the channel. So far, it's missing Dream Eaters and Circle Undone. After Edge of the Earth, those will be the only official campaigns yet to be ranked. I will be ranking fan campaigns as I play them as well. But let's get right into it. Let's talk about where we're ranking the stuff from Edge of the Earth. Before we do, quickly going back over the tier list, we have the best scenarios in the game, where I just really enjoy the scenario. Flavorfully, it works. Thematically, I'm liking what's happening. And mechanically, it's very interesting and engaging and difficult. A+ scenarios are just the same to a lesser degree. A, again, same to the lesser degree. Once we start getting to good scenarios, there tends to be something wrong with it. Maybe it's not hard enough to be engaging. Maybe flavorfully, something is really off. They're not at the same level at all as their counterparts. These three top tiers are all just different gradations of I really, really like this scenario, but good's just good. Fine means when I play this scenario, I don't groan, but I don't have any emotional response whatsoever. I'm not looking forward to it, I'm not dreading it, it's just a scenario. Bad scenarios, I have a negative reaction, I don't want to go play them. There is something wrong with these scenarios that makes my experience on the whole negative, and F tier scenarios are not awful scenarios, they are don't play these scenarios. You show up to Undimensioned and Unseen, just resign, don't do it. You show up to Kuala Lumpur, why'd you do that? You should have went somewhere else. And as always, we'll be ranking these in the order that they appear in the scenario, or in the campaign rather, starting with Ice and Death Part 1. I think I really like Ice and Death Part 1. You'll notice Last King has fallen a lot since last time we saw a tier list. This is as a result of our most recent playthrough as Carson, Harvey, and Tony, where we showed up, just destroyed the scenario, and left before the party got started. There was almost no fighting. I wasn't aware that you could actually have a result of The Last King that wasn't a super difficult non-stop fight, which is why it drops so much, as it turns out there's just like random and unengaging ways it can play out, and that really hurt my opinion of it. I think Ice and Death Part 1 is actually better as a result of all those criticisms. I think Ice and Death Part 1 is a scenario where you have time to set up and you're less intuitive, less consistent starting decks that can be, a bit janky. And then you have this huge bloom of fighting that happens towards the middle and end of it. You have a terrifying boss. We haven't seen anything like the Ghoul Priest since The Gathering. There are very few Scenario 1 bosses that are that hard. The only other thing that comes to mind is Curtain Call's Royal Emissary. Ice and Death Part 1 is just a really, really good opening scenario. Hell, I like it more than Threads of Fate, because it has degrees of completion. That's the thing that I really like seeing. It's part of why Midnight Mask is so good. Is you're not playing Ice and Death Part 1 to win, you're playing to do as much as you can and get out alive. Going into Ice and Death Part 2, my opinion is tremendously lower. Ice and Death Part 2 is a necessary part of the Ice and Death 3-part scenario structure. You need more time to get clues, open locations, and recover supplies. There needed to be a third scenario, and as a result, Ice and Death Part 2 needed to exist. However, Ice and Death Part 2 has next to no traditional fighting, which is very unfortunate for the same reasons that Miskatonic Museum is very unfortunate. It can feel very random if you're not great at the test it's asking you to do, then as a result, it can just give you several additional copies of Ancient Evils, and those tests aren't easy. Evade by 2 or more against a 2-foot enemy or Parlay 3 book, that's essentially foot 4 or book 3, but those actually go up to book 4 and foot 5 because there's a Mythos card that will attach those guys. If they aren't in play, it'll summon a new one and attach to them. And those Mythos cards, like doing a book 4 test is not actually that easy. There are cluers that don't use book, and in addition, a lot of cluers that are using book are using things like magnifying glasses that help them on an investigate test, not just a generic test. A foot 5 test is actually just incredibly hard. There is no one that is reliably doing foot 5 in scenario 2. That's just not a thing. And even as Finn, right, with manual decks in my deck and a free evade action, I would regularly get those guys and be like, all right, I'm going to evade at +1 and I'm going to end my turn at this location so I can try again next turn with another free action, because there's just no way to do that test easily. And the randomness of those Ancient Evils copies is a big part of what makes an already mediocre scenario that needed to exist but wasn't necessarily good on its own a lot worse. I think it still gets to be fine. I don't think it's a good scenario. On the whole, it does a lot that's good for the Ice and Death 3-part scenario. I think I like playing it more than I like playing Vanishing of Alina Harper or Without a Trace. I think that's definitely true. It offers a lot of unique things that you plan your decks around, and generally I like that a lot. Before the Black Throne would be at the very top of my tier list because it offers tech choices. But Ice and Death Part 2 isn't really offering tech choices so much as placing pressure on which investigators you bring in your team, which is not the sort of thing I want to view as a tech choice. It has enough unpleasant about it that I dislike it, but there's a lot good for it. You're still playing the awesome Ice and Death map, you're still doing degrees of completion, you're still getting experience and progressing things in ways that feel natural and intuitive, and I do really like most of what Ice and Death is from a meta perspective. The gameplay pattern is fine, bar the random ancient evils and lack of fighting. It's not bad, but it has a lot of problems. I'm trying to decide if I want to put Ice and Death Part 3 in my A+ tier. It is, I think, the only scenario in the game that just tells you to go fight stuff. If you did well in Ice and Death's Part 1 and 2, there is no clue finding in Ice and Death Part 3. If you don't need to open a location, then there is literally not a use for clues in this scenario, which you could argue is a design oversight, but I argue is very clearly the intention. If you were that good at clue finding, then congratulations, you should have been doing something else. It's like a clear message from the developers that they're mad at Amanda. But I like that this is a scenario with literally no clue finding and you can know that going in, or that you know exactly how many clues you need to get to completely finish the scenario because you know which locations you need to open. I really enjoy Ice and Death Part 3 as being a purely fighting scenario and being something you should be considering when you enter into a campaign. Because unlike Ice and Death Part 2, where you say, we need investigators to pass X test, now you're saying all of our investigators need to be able to deal damage, which is a very different statement that is far more easily achieved by everyone than a 5-foot test. It's very close to Mirage right now, which feels right considering how fighting focused Mirage is. I like it more than Midnight Mask. And the reason I like it more than Midnight Mask is the decision point about whether or not you can save yourself the time and risk of being in the scenario longer by walking on to an Eidolon that still has cards under it. That decision point that we've always backed out of at my table, but I managed to do with Finn and Ice and Death Part 3 on the channel, where you're deciding, can I go in? Can I kill these 3 face down cards before they flip? That's really good. I like that a lot. I don't think I like it more than Shattered Aeons or Dancing Mad, but I do think it gets to be in my A+. I really like Ice and Death Part 3. Next up, I'm going to rate Fatal Mirage, even though technically I played it 6. You get access to it here, I'm going to rank it now. It's not in Daunt tier, because you should play Fatal Mirage, you want Resolute allies, you want the experience. But do I think it's better than extracurricular activities? Like, it's not a good scenario. Fatal Mirage has its own mechanic, the Mirage system, that's just like a mess. You get to play it a second and third time, but then you get Frostbite tokens in the bag, and in addition, the already messy Mirage mechanic gets messier. The first time you play it, and even the second time, you read Mirage the first time or a second time, you're like, man, I feel like I'm missing something. This just feels like the nastiest version of Veiled in the world. There's no map and you're building a map, but it's just a bunch of straight lines with random connections in the first locations, basically. It's just like a boring map. Again, like Ice and Death Part 2, there's a lot of things where fighting traditionally doesn't work. It's something you can be sent to early in the campaign, and then find out that because you're here early, you're not able to fight some of the enemies you actually do have to fight in this scenario. I just feel like the design is a mess. The scenario is repetitive. I don't think you should ever play it a second or third time, and the Frostbite tokens make it sound like the game doesn't want you to either. From a meta structure, I love how it fits into the campaign. It's exactly what I want to see. I don't really care about being an open world when you print the whole box at once. Like, it's cool that you can do that now. I really love stuff like Fatal Mirage and stuff like Ice and Death, where you have scenarios that happen at different points in the campaign depending on events, or scenarios that have like big maps with multiple different iterations of the map and different rule sets. But the actual scenario that is Fatal Mirage, not like what it represents for what campaigns can do, but what Fatal Mirage is as a scenario, I think it's just bad. I think School's better. I think Fatal Mirage is just like not as fun as School. And I have nothing good to say about it, so yeah, I'm gonna leave it towards the top of my bad tier. Next up, we have one of the simplest scenarios in the game, Climb the Mountain. I really enjoy climbing the mountain. I don't know how high it gets to be, but I'm pretty sure it gets to be in my A+. A+ tier is just becoming Edge of the Earth tier, isn't it? I'll go ahead and spoil it. City of the Elders is up next. It's also gonna get to live in A+. Like, literally half the campaign is in my A+ tier. I think Climbing the Mountain gets to live between Threads of Fate and The Last King. I think Forbidden Peaks is a wonderfully simple scenario that works so well thematically. As the placement of Marrakesh will tell you, I really enjoy being given a small map and told to go do stuff. Like, Blood on the Altar is not a big map either. Dim Carcosa is honestly not that big. There's a lot of bigger maps higher ranked, but being a small map is something that I view as a refreshing change of pace. I like all of the enemies thematically. I like the mechanics involving the different levels of the mountain. I like having a big boss that shows up. I'm not a fan of dropping your assets, which is the least fun form of difficulty. I think Forbidden Peaks gets to live here. It's a very, very good scenario. The flavor is very on point. It's a very simple, mechanically solid scenario, and I like it a lot. City of the Elder Things probably gets to be my highest ranked scenario in the sets, because unlike many scenarios that are degrees of completion where you're not really expected to finish it, like Midnight Mask and Threads of Fate, and unlike things like The Quest for Kadath, City of Elder Things is actually fully completable. It's very hard to do. Most teams cannot do it, but you can full complete City of the Elder Things. I really like the set of enemies you see in this scenario. I feel like if I play this scenario a dozen times, I'll get tired of the randomness. But honestly, it feels as though it has plenty of ways to mitigate randomness with the tunnel locations, with just discussing with your teammates who goes where. I think it really aggressively punishes like two-handed solo with Fighter Clover where you have to stay together and you can't split up. But I'm fine with that. I think that generally speaking, if you're reliant on that structure, it's a bad thing for your party, and a scenario that punishes that doesn't bother me at all. Pallid Mask, Untamed Wilds, and Too Deep, City of Elder Things are all very close to each other. I think I like it more than the Catacombs. I like it more than Untamed Wilds too. It's so close between those two, but I think it goes at the top of my A+. I can't put it in S. Like, in my heart, I have scenarios like In Too Deep where I'm like, does this get to be an S? I don't have that thought with City of the Elder Things. I know it's not going out of A+, but it does get to live at the very top of A+. It's not as hard as the Untamed Wilds because you're just allowed to win without finishing it, unlike Untamed Wilds. But actually full completing it is very hard, and I like the challenge of full completing at City of the Elder Things. In addition, I think just like the tuning is right exactly where it should be. I'm gonna put it under Untamed Wilds, specifically because there are a couple of cards that have a lot of mental load for no reason, and the scenario would have been better without them. I think the mental load of some cards being a little bit too clunky is what keeps it down from the top of my A+. Which brings us to Heart of Madness Part 1. And I think as a starting point, I definitely like this more than Into the Maelstrom. When I move the other part of the finale up here as well, we'll talk about it in a little while. I think Part 1 is a degrees of completion scenario, but unlike City of the Elder Things, I feel like it's a degrees of completion scenario that has a lot of challenging things in it that City of the Elder Things didn't. So I'm looking at Heart of Madness Part 1 and thinking about City of the Elder Things. They're comparably large maps. They're both degrees of completion scenarios. So if they're both comparably hard, why don't I like Heart of Madness Part 1 nearly as much? I think flavorfully a lot of cards in it don't quite work for me, which comes down to like another thing. I love the Mountains of Madness, I love the Yithians, but the Nameless Madness doesn't have any thematic resonance for me whatsoever. Like there's nothing there in my heart at all for this, I don't care. So I really like all the Shoggoths and that sort of stuff, but when we start talking about the Nameless Madness, which will be a much bigger part of Heart of Madness Part 2, I have no interest. I think my big thing with this scenario is that City of the Elder Things doesn't require you to do a bunch of different tests that have different requirements around the map. I think that makes Heart of Madness a degrees of completion scenario that's a much less interesting form of degrees of completion, where you have to go find all the locations with the test, and then you have to send the right person to the right place to do the thing. And also, because you have to get the keys and put the keys down as actions instead of lightning bolts, or the seals rather, I think it is a much, much worse level of player scaling than what you see in City of the Elder Things. If City of the Elder Things required you to spend an action to pick up a key, I would rate it so much lower. And that's basically why Heart of Madness is going to live somewhere in very good. I think it's going to live all the way at the bottom of very good. Like, I started it over here next to Mirage, and then it's like, it's worse than Back Time, it's worse than Gods, it's worse than Doom, it's worse than Curtain Call, worse than Time and Space, worse than City of Archives, worse than Pit of Despair, worse than Horror, worse than Dogs of War. And now we have to check if it actually deserves to be in very good. It does. It's way better than Riddles and Rain. Okay, we're safe. It still gets to be in very good. I'm surprised at how low it is. Very good's a better tier than I give it credit for. Now, let's get to the finale. Let's get to Heart of Madness Part 2. I still think it's better than Into the Maelstrom, but it has its problems. I think, generally speaking, it's undertuned for a finale. I think it's very easy to steamroll this. And I think the second part of the scenario, just like, it was already a long scenario. Why do we have this random stuff with the ramps at the end where we take foot tests 4 times in a row or we spend clues and then we get to win? It feels like a completely pointless victory lap at the end that just shouldn't have been there. Like, if you had just told me in the flavor text we escaped down a giant ramp in the resolution, I would have the exact same opinion as I do having played it out. Except then I wouldn't have wasted 20 minutes of my life playing it out, which is how I feel about that second part. I feel like it has a lot of interesting play things that happen in it that are very unique to Heart of Madness Part 2 because of its very unique final boss. But as I put it here and talk about it, I feel like the enemies you see in Into the Maelstrom, the challenges put forward to you, are harder than what you see in Heart of Madness Part 2. And I think Into the Maelstrom, in the end, becomes a meaningfully more engaging scenario than Heart of Madness Part 2. I'm not putting it under Essex County Express, that's for sure. And I do think it's better than Heart of the Elders Part 2. I think these are much worse than the other scenarios in good, but they are better than fine. I think Heart of Madness Part 2 is just barely beneath Into the Maelstrom. There we go, that's part of the problem. Black Star's Rise is being criminally overrated. It does not deserve to be that high. I don't even think it deserves to be this high. It is better than fine. I do like Black Stars, but it's probably not much better than Essex County. It deserves to be at the bottom down here. I'm also going to move all of this stuff, Lair of Dagon, Maelstrom, and Madness above Sanguine Shadows as well. And now this is just where it ends with lives, I guess. I mean, yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's how it should be. This is scenario 6, 7, and 8 in a campaign defined by the last scenarios being way too easy. Yeah, no, it's undertuned. All of these scenarios would have been so much better, but they're undertuned, and they all live side by side because of it. That is exactly where they go. In Heart of Madness, Part 2 is the exact same boat, except it also has a pointless finale that wasted my time. So yeah, I'm very happy with that being the placement all of those things end up in now. So to go back through it, half of the campaign lives in A+. City of the Elder Things is a fantastic degrees of completion scenario. Same with Ice and Death Part 1, except it has a really hard fighting challenge for Scenario 1. Forbidden Peaks is one of the simplest, tightest scenarios in terms of thematics and mechanics in the entire Arkham Horror franchise. Ice and Death Part 3 is the only scenario in the franchise that says, hey, it's time to kill stuff. And like, yeah, theoretically, you could show up and have your cleaver need to do stuff if things haven't been going well. But I much prefer just like showing up to a brawl when there's nothing else to think about. I enjoy that it gives you this big map with weird interconnection rules where you run around the enemies, and it's very interesting to think about and optimize. It's also the fastest scenario I've ever completed on the channel. I think I did it in under 30 minutes after editing. The raw recording was around 40 minutes. I really enjoyed just being given a really simple, really fast fight scenario as the finale to this huge map. Then down in A tier, we got Heart of Madness Part 1 at the very bottom. I do really like this scenario. It is a big degrees of completion scenario, but it has a very annoying action tax with the skills and the picking up and putting down of the clues. Then at the very bottom of very good, we have Heart of Madness. You have to pick up the clue, or sorry, the seal, then you have to charge the seal. Both of those require tests that are going to vary from seal to seal. You have to travel around the map to find all of these things. You have to spend an action to put it down. You might have to spend an action to hand it over. The bad player scaling is what really puts Heart of Madness Part 1 all the way down at very good's bottom. If it were player scaled better, if all of the things I just said were lightning bolts instead, and the scenario were just generally a little bit harder instead in some way, it would probably move up substantially, maybe even all the way to A+. But its bad player scaling is what's really holding it down for me. Then we got Heart of Madness Part 2. This one doesn't have a problem with player scaling, it has a problem with being too easy and then wasting my time at the end. But other than that, it's a very good scenario, and if it were more challenging, much like the last half of Innsmouth, it would rank a lot higher. And then we get into the last two scenarios that really hold the campaign down a little bit. Ice and Death Part 2 is thematically wonderful. Within the structure of the campaign, it does something very important. But as a scenario, I don't enjoy playing it at all. It's just a slog. It's a slog that requires you to do very specific things that places pressure on which characters you bring to the campaign. It's a slog where, to some degree, the results are random. You could just have like only one guy missing and still fail to save him if he showed up in the last spot that was furthest from you. And that's including the 2 spots you're checking with agendas. I know you can check 2 spots. It can still just be a thing where you randomly lose a guy and didn't have the ability to save him, especially when you take into account like how much of the map is going to be revealed for Ice and Death Part 1 being somewhat random. And then Fatal Mirage Part 1, if I were ranking Part 2 and 3, they'd both be down here and don't. I don't even have pictures of them, but if I did, I would be putting them here. Fatal Mirage Part 1 is a bad scenario. I think that maybe it player scales poorly because the first time we played it, we just like got like around 10 experience out of it. It was wild. and this time with very good characters, I only got 3. So it might be bad player scaling, it might have been really bad RNG, I'm not quite sure what happened in my playthrough, but that's not why it's down here. You don't get to see a map. When you find out what the map is, it's a bunch of branching straight lines. You do the same thing over and over until you get bored and leave. There's a single 15 Doom agenda, it's just a timer, nothing progresses as the game goes on. There's just nothing good about Fatal Mirage. I feel like all the design work went into letting me play it 3 times, but I only played the first part and it was so unpleasant that I never played it an additional time. And that's just really unfortunate. But on the whole, as you can clearly see by the new Edge of the Earth tier up here in A+, I really like this campaign. The finale is still a good scenario, it's just not good for a finale. And there are some scenarios that hold it down, but I mean, like, basically every campaign has those, so that's fine. On the whole, I really liked playing Edge of the Earth, and I'm looking forward to playing it again someday. But for now, I'm done. I've been Random Incoherent. I hope you enjoyed hearing me talk about the scenarios for a little while. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff really does help the channel grow, and I'll see you in the next one.